Hi everyone, I'm really excited to be here with a special guest who is neurotypical, and she's going to be describing her experiences and, in particular, what it's like to be a neurotypical person. So, do you want to start by just introducing yourself a bit?
Sure. So my name is Stephanie. I'm an occupational therapist by trade. That's my day job. And I guess I'm also a mother of two children and I'm married. I have three pets. So I have a lot going on in my household, but I'm also a co-founder of a TheraFriends Community Partnership, and Sam is on our board. So that was our connection. And so this is a passion that we share.
Thank you so much. And just kind of to start with, what led you to realize that you are neurotypical? My understanding is that a lot of times people who are neurotypical might not have to think about that as much growing up, but yeah, I would just love to hear what that process was like for you. Was there ever a period of time where you were questioning whether you were neurotypical or neurodivergent, or was it just kind of automatically clear once you learned about the concept?
Right. And so I was mentioning this to Sam before we started recording that like a lot of these questions are super great questions and something I really had to think about because and there's a privilege right there, right? So I just want to point out that and a disclaimer before I talk about and answer any of these questions, I am just, just like anyone who is neurodivergent, I feel like anyone who is considered neurotypical, like we're all different, right? So I'm not speaking for everybody, I'm just speaking for myself. And there's going to be a lot of overlap, I feel, um, in some things of how we feel or think or, react to things. But it's just going to be, I feel like it's more of a societal thing that will come into play when I answer some of these questions. So I feel like I never thought about my neurotype until I started learning about neurodivergence. And you're like, okay. And I think about it in terms of my work, but then thinking about it at home, it's just a totally different thing. And like I mentioned before, it's kind of like when you have a privilege, when you're part of the majority in a society, it's not something that's forefront because everything is just built around how you function. And I feel like that's just kind of how it is. And um, you don't have to think about things because it's easy, because it's just there. Um, because it's not something, it's what most people expect. Um, so that's why I hadn't really thought about it. And then there was a time when I was learning about, the umbrella of everything that people have put under what is neurodivergence, like what other things kind of come into play. And there are a lot of things that people have put under there, including, like mental health stuff, like anxiety, and then we, of course, there's the things that people think about most, like autism, ADHD, and um, it's like, yeah, I have some anxiety, and there are things that have caused some issues in my life with that, but I feel like it's not a constant, and it's not something that I feel like it's more situational. That it's not always with me. I was reading some article about that. Someone was pointing out that there are certain parts of under that umbrella of neurodivergence that they didn't quite, this was somebody's opinion, they didn't quite agree, and they were neurodivergent, didn't quite agree with because it's like kind of fleeting, kind of not always with you, or something that you quote unquote treat like depression, and could not have those symptoms for a long period of time. So I'm kind of putting myself in that realm. So I just don't really feel like I would put myself in that category, just because of that. But, for the most part, um, it was just thinking about, learning, just to sum up, like learning about neurodivergence and how those were not things I had to think about. Like all the things that people have talked about their struggles being neurodivergent. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that would be a struggle. And that being brought to the forefront by talking to people and hearing from people and realizing that I did not have those issues. So I feel like that's more of where I came up with my like thoughts about that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. And it tentatively, I wonder if no one is really maybe completely neurotypical, but rather there might be people who feel like the description fits them most of the time or in most ways. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and if I could just ask as a follow-up, do you know like approximately what stage of your life you started hearing about neurodivergence? Was this like as a child, a teenager, an adult?
Hmm. Oh, definitely as an adult. I mean, I feel like the way that it was, and even maybe more in the past few years, which is a terrible thing in the sense like it's embarrassing to be like I'm a professional, OT, and I didn't even hear really or start using the term more regularly, um, neurodivergence until a couple of years ago, just in grad school. I don't know if it was in our texts. I don't know if it was in our teachings. I feel like we learned, they'd say autism. That was a word that I heard a lot. Or they used, ASD or whatever terms that they used in school. But or ADHD, like I feel like it was separated out. It wasn't, and of course, with this movement, it's because we want to, kind of not medicalize everything, right? But I feel like that's what we were doing in school when I was in school. So just as a reference point, I graduated from grad school in 2008. So it's been a little while, but not that long, at the same time. So it's a little disappointing, but I'm hoping that these are things that are changing in schools. And obviously these are the reason why we're doing things like this is to get the word out there more as well to professionals and anybody. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, not that long ago.
Yeah, thank you so much for for your patience with that question. I have now a very specific question that I've been curious about for quite a while. So
Okay.
I know that with autism we often talk about special interests and intense interests, and I
Hmm.
certainly experience that really all-consuming intense interest. I was wondering,
Hmm.
what do interests or hobbies feel like as a neurotypical person? I know you probably can't speak for all neurotypical people, but in your case,
Right.
what, yeah, what is that like? What do you think distinguishes maybe neurotypical intense interests and, for example, autistic intense interests?
Right. So when I, hear about autistic like people being so intensely interested in something that they kind of get all encompassed in it and they learn all these different things about it and they like it's almost like when you're involved, you like lose that sense of time. Um, and it's funny because when I think about it, I learned about something to this, kind of fact when we were in grad school for OT. We called it being in flow. And it was kind of a way for us to think about kind of a just right challenge for our clients or whatever, like, or even just anybody, if you're doing something that is too challenging, then it's, something you really think about. Sometimes it makes it feel like it's taking a long time, or something that's too easy could be the same thing, right? Or something you're not that interested in, like all these different factors come in. But if you find something that you're just interested in enough that it's just the right challenge, where it's like just challenging enough to keep your brain involved, but you're not getting bored, but it's not too difficult, people will get in this state they call flow, which is like you lose sense of time, and sometimes you don't notice bodily cues, like you don't realize you have to go to the bathroom or that you're hungry, things like that. But it's described in this like good sense, like it's just like this good feeling because it's something that you're just so engrossed in. Um, but so I thought about that when I hear about autistic interests, because it's something that it's like we were taught almost as that's what we're trying to reach for. That's something that would be an ideal in a situation. I feel like it's harder to come by when you're neurotypical. Um, I don't know why that is. I just feel like it's just obviously the difference in the way that our brains work. Almost a little jealous about that part because I try to be careful of that word because I know that sometimes it can be difficult. This could be a difficult thing for some people. Um, but for the most part, I feel like people are engrossed in things that bring them joy. And to have that kind of focus and intense joy sounds lovely. I just feel like that's hard for us to do for some reason. Like I think about my hobbies, like I enjoy art, I paint, I go to dance classes. I love doing those things, and I get engrossed in the time I'm doing it, but it's not always that way, and it's not always, and it's not the only things that I'll talk about, like it's just not all encompassing for some reason. It's like we divvy things up a little bit more or, space things out in our lives a little bit more. I'm not quite sure. Um, but that's how it's kind of is. Like, I kind of wish there was something I was that engrossed in that oftentimes. Like I feel like it's more oftentimes that you get into the state of flow versus like just when you hit the mark right once in a while. Um, and so that's how I thought about it. And I kind of wish it was a little bit easier for neurotypical people to be able to do that. For some reason, it's just a little bit harder. We get distracted. I'm not quite sure. It's like we're just at a lower level of engagement.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. It's really interesting to kind of think about maybe people with more monotropism or intense interest might be allocating all of our intensity into one thing, whereas perhaps for neurotypical people it may be more perhaps the total amount of interest is the same, but it's spread out or more um,
Right. That's what it seems like on a whole.
fluctuating with
Of
activities or
course, we can
environments.
have
Yeah,
overlaps.
that's really interesting. Thank you. And then the next question is, are there examples of social conventions like small talk or maybe any other kind of unwritten social rule or expectation that you genuinely enjoy? And maybe in particular, if there's something that seems to be more commonly enjoyed by neurotypical people, is there something that you really relate to? And if so, what do you enjoy about these conventions?
So that's a really good question too. And of course, I think it'll vary on people's personality types, but on a whole, um, I feel like small talk, like when when you hear people describe it, you're like, yeah, what's the point? Like when you really think about all these little social rules and you break them down, you're like, why do we do this? And it's like a lot of the times the answer is just because that's how it is. Like when you don't have answers and it's kind of like, you're right. That is, why is it like that? And I feel like small talk is one of those things where you're like, why am I doing this? And I can see how a lot of neurodivergent people would be like, why the heck would I even like, I'm not even, what's the point? Um, but I feel like for me, I really enjoy I really enjoy a lot of social connections. And I feel like maybe that's something a lot of neurotypical people will lean more towards. Not everybody though. And I feel like personality type comes into play here. And I'll explain in a second. But like I feel like maybe we more lean towards kind of this need to be accepted. I feel like that's always kind of a nagging thing. It's not necessarily a great thing. I think it's what society accepts more. Um, but it's just like this need for other people to see you in a positive light. Um, and, when people talk about, having good self-confidence and things like that, they're often like, well, then you shouldn't care what other people think. But I feel like it's really hard to do for like people like me. Like, I just feel like I wish I didn't care how much people thought or trying to please people. But small talk, I feel like there's a layer of that in there because it might be a conversation that's very surface, like just trying to get to know someone that maybe you just met. I enjoy doing that though. I enjoy meeting new people. I enjoy talking. I enjoy conversation. I enjoy when people ask about me. Like I feel like that's a joyful thing to me. But in terms of personality, I feel like I'm an extrovert. But I talk to other people who are like neurotypical but are introverts, right? And I kind of define that to myself as like an extrovert is someone who, when talking to people, it like gives you energy, and that's what happens to me. And like introverts will say it like drains them, and they just like need to go home and be by themselves. I mean, there are days when you feel that way, and that's what I mean. Like it's all like relative, but on a whole, I'll come home from like a party or a gathering or just hanging out with friends. And if that's my bedtime when I get home, I cannot fall asleep. I'm like jazzed. I need to like wind down. Um, and it's kind of annoying because if I'm out and I'm like, oh man, look at the time, like I'm never gonna get to sleep. So it's something that, just kind of brings me energy. And I enjoy it. I enjoy talking to people. I enjoy, learning about things, making jokes and, whatever. Sharing humor with people. I enjoy that kind of stuff. Um, so that's my perspective on that part. I just feel like it's something I didn't think about until I had to sit and think about it. And then it's like, do I enjoy this? But not everybody does. So I feel like there's a lot of variables with things like that.
Yeah, that's thank you again for that answer. It's really interesting, and I especially appreciate the point you brought up about different personality types and extroversion versus introversion. I've been wondering for a while if, yeah, if extroversion in autistic and neurotypical individuals, and I guess other neurodivergent individuals who may not be autistic, if between the different forms of neurodivergence or neurotypes, if it presents in a different way. I'm guessing it probably does,
Mhm.
but yeah,
Yeah, I would think so.
I
But
I
I
think I'm
feel like
very yeah.
in terms of like bringing you joy, energy, whatever it
Yeah,
is that like that special thing that you're like, this works for me, this works for my body, this isn't overwhelming. Um, you know, but having said that, like I said, sometimes there are days where I'm like, I'm overwhelmed. I just want to sit by myself and like watch a TV show
yeah,
I've watched 20,000 times because I don't have to, like I need to wind down.
yeah.
Um, so it's just all again relative to lots of factors.
Perhaps related to this, do you find these unwritten rules to be pretty intuitive? Are they things that you think you might have kind of developed on your own, or are they things that you just were able to really easily absorb or detect from other people?
Right, that's a really interesting question. Because again, that's something I thought about, and I'm like, where do you learn this stuff? I mean, I would assume, and then like I catch myself saying things to my kids, like, you have to act this way towards your friend. You should say things like that, say thank you when someone does this, do that, like all these different customs and things that we're expected to do and again, I feel like it always comes back to being liked, being seen as good, being seen as, like especially with kids, like you don't want someone to think your kid is spoiled or bratty or, like whatever it is that as a parent that I would not want to hear about my child. So you're like, you have to say these certain things or do these certain things, or this is how you are with friends, this is how you are with family. Um, because kids, I feel like it's not totally intuitive. I feel like these are all made up rules that we come up with. And this summer we traveled to different countries in Europe with my children, and it's like it's a culture. Like it's different everywhere you go. There's little nuances to different things, and when you're out of that culture, I mean, out of your culture and into a different one, it can be kind of unnerving because you're like, well, I don't want to be perceived as this not good person. And I feel like, for example, Americans are, have this rap being kind of, demanding or kind of selfish or kind of loud or, like whatever is in certain countries. And I like really was trying to be careful not to come off, not knowing some of their rules. So I feel like, it's kind of like that. It's a culture. It's these spoken rules that you just kind of learn. I feel like it mostly is from your family, from friends, from school. I feel like as you're growing up, these are things you're told to do and act like so that people perceive you as in a certain way. Because you want to be liked and you want to be, kind of liked and seen and all that kind of stuff. But um, and thinking about it too, I feel like it's different in with genders too. I'm sure things that I was told to act like might be different from what a boy is told to act like, and we have seen many psychological studies done on that, and you know, what's acceptable for a little girl and what's acceptable for a little boy. I mean, I feel like it starts young. Um, so that's kind of what I think is just learning it when you're younger. Is it intuitive? I don't know. Like when you're just told this is the way it is and you just kind of accept it, maybe it wasn't because I was taught it. But now as an adult, I feel like I'm spurting it out to my kids. And I feel like that is just something that most people do. It's like I can't help myself or something. Like it's not something I have to sit and think about, like, okay, how am I? It's like I just say it, like, wait, you're supposed to do this. Um, so I think it is now, but I think it's just because it's drilled into you.
Yeah, that makes sense. Something I've wondered about the intuitive component is whether neurotypical people on average are more able to um, kind of approximate the gist of a rule and then generalize it to other situations without really thinking about it consciously. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
autistic people, generally speaking, seem more likely to memorize expectations on a case by case basis, so might be more able to see subtle differences between situations, but
Right,
then might also find it harder to figure out, like, well, if this rule applies here, do I apply it to situation B as well? Do I, apply a
right.
modified variant on it? And so, yeah, the process by which people learn or don't learn or choose to engage with or choose to, not follow different social expectations for various reasons, I think is a really interesting one.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a really good point. That could be the big difference because I feel like generalizing to different situations, I don't think that's very difficult. Like I don't feel like that's something I'm actively thinking about. And then,
That's
you bringing that
fascinating.
up, it's like I don't think I've thought about that. Yeah, I guess I do that. Um, but also, tying into it too, like a lot of these rules have a lot to do with how other people are reacting. So it's like maybe if it's difficult for like someone to interpret how other people are feeling or thinking. And I feel like I've always kind of touted myself as someone who can kind of do that pretty well. Maybe too much. Maybe I'm like reading into things too much sometimes. Or like, oh no, this person's mad at me, and maybe they're not totally mad at me, but maybe they're irritated at something else. But to me, I'm like, you know, on insecurities or something like that. But I feel like what you reading people or body language, that kind of thing, facial expressions, tone of voice. Um, I feel like that's something that is tied into it a lot too. And if that's really difficult for someone, I feel like it would be very confusing and not translate to other situations as well. Because, it's just a lot of information to take in, a lot of details.
Yes, absolutely. Social
Mhm.
situations have so many different variables to them.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, thank you for that. That's definitely interesting. The next question is a little bit of an obscure one, but in a hypothetical world where most people are neurodivergent, and maybe neurotypical people are a relatively small percent of the population, I guess perhaps inverting the percentages of our current world, what accommodations do you think neurotypical people would find most helpful? And I guess the reason I'm asking this is because my perspective is that we all have accommodation needs, but maybe if most of the world or most people socialize or have similar accommodation needs to you, they might be met a little bit more automatically. So I think autistic people or neurodivergent people might have a really clear awareness of where accommodation needs are because yeah, logistically we have to. But
Right.
I've been wondering a lot, what would accommodations for neurotypical people look like in a predominantly autistic environment?
So again, that was another question that, I mean, all these questions made me think where I'm like, what would that be? Because it's like trying to piece apart our culture and our society, um, and think about what things are helpful and what things aren't. But like when I really think about it, like when we have an inclusive environment, right? And what we're trying to teach everybody to have inclusive environments to make it more accommodating for everybody of every I feel like it helps everybody. Like I feel like the accommodations, like a lot of times I've even heard about accommodations, for neurodivergent people, and I'm like that would be helpful to me too, like in certain situations, obviously not all the time, and I don't need it all the time or as much. um but I feel like it's helpful to everybody to have um just everything be more accessible. I don't know if we had I feel like if it was flipped and we had a world run by, neurodivergent people, which who could be, coming. Um, I feel like it would be an inclusive environment. Also because, you know, neurodivergent, diversity. It's everyone's different, right? So everyone's needing different things. And if we just have all those things included, that would include neurotypical people too. Um, in that realm somewhere. I feel like neurodivergent people would be really good at that. to to make sure that it's all bases are covered. But um so like specific stuff, I'm not quite sure because I just feel like if it's inclusive, it's including everybody. And that's why that's the, avenue we want to kind of take and see if we can get society to go that way because it's just it everyone thrives, right? So if everyone's able to be able, to do what they need to do, um, everyone benefits. So I just feel like that would be very well done and a much more inclusive and functional society if that's how it was.
You bring up a great point about how broad the umbrella of neurodivergence is. So if we
Right.
can really accommodate everyone who's neurodivergent, probably any other neurotype might have enough overlap with at least one aspect too. Um,
Right. Like if even if like specific examples, like, when we had our big event, fundraising event, and then we had our like sensory room. So like if somebody is ready to, like you have everything there. So just having the inclusive part is good for everyone. So if you want to be talking to somebody or dancing or listening to the music or eating or drinking, you can be in this part. If you don't feel like doing that right now, you can be in the quieter room and you can have your fidgets and you can have headphones and you can like, I just feel like when you have like what that inclusivity means is there's options for everybody to be able to be their best selves during whatever it is that we need to do. So that would be inclusive to everybody. So, if I'm just feeling like I don't feel like talking to anybody right now, I'm having a bad day, and I could just go, like it would be there for me because that's what we've made. Um, and I just, I feel like anybody could utilize different accommodations, and it would be beneficial.
yeah, I think you just wonderfully answered my last question already,
Oh,
which is great. But I'll just ask it in case there's anything else that any other thoughts you have on it, which is, yeah, kind of along the lines of this conjecture that neurodiversity affirming practices, of course, we're hoping that they're good for neurodivergent people, but more generally, I believe that and hope that they're beneficial for everyone. So I'd love your perspective on, are there any other ways that learning about accommodations, accessibility, or anything related to neurodiversity has um, helped with your own life or well-being or general perspective on anything?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I feel like, like I've said, even just personally, I like to feel like I went into a helping profession. I want to be able to help people, but also seeing things from people's perspectives. And it's really helpful personally and professionally for me to understand everybody's perspective because, I don't want to make other people feel uncomfortable or kind of force my rule or what I want to do on somebody if that's not something that makes them feel good. I don't want, I want to be aware of that. And that's why I think it's important that we have these conversations because nobody, I feel like for the most part, nobody out there wants to make other people feel worse or feel like they are lesser than or feel like they don't fit in or they need to fix something about themselves. I feel like we generally don't want to do that. And it's just when you're just skirting along in this society, not having to think about that the thing that you're doing is actually very difficult for somebody else. And that if we just tweak it this way, you can still do it just fine, but this person cannot do it. I feel like that's something that we need to, just run with and just make it, so it's good for everybody because that's what, like I said before, that's just what makes everything, it makes society so much better when everybody's able to do what they need to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you again for your time and for sharing your
Absolutely.
perspective. I know I learned a lot. I'll be thinking about especially some of the points you mentioned about intuitively learning different social rules.
Hmm.
And yeah, pretty much everything else you mentioned is what I'll be thinking about for a while. So thank you again.
Yes, and thank you. Like, having these questions and having us, sit and think and discuss. And I'm sure other people have different opinions than me. Just starting these discussions and starting people to think about these things, I feel like is really important. So thank you for putting that to the forefront.